So from here on, we are introducing our imaginary that we have developed together for decolonizing educational relationships, starting in this one with spirituality, and I'll hand over to Fatima for this first part. Thank you, Fatima.
I hope that most of you did get a chance to watch the pre-recorded videos. And as we did in the 2 pre-recorded videos, where we shared with you for, we interwove our own narratives and showed you how we developed our own theoretical position and used other scholars' theory to either to justify, or not even to justify, to provide rationale that these are the ways that other scholars are also looking at doing and viewing education otherwise. In doing this, our purpose is to disrupt hegemonic Euro-Western mainstream colonial ways of presenting theory. Here I begin with a narrative of my own. I'd like you all to close your eyes if you can. So close your eyes and imagine that against your skin, you can feel a fabric that is gloriously soft and luxurious, at the same time satiny and soft, the likes that you've never had caressing your skin. This same fabric effortlessly embracing a multitude of patterns and designs, embodied with rich, deep jewel colors.
But it's been alleged is how I. And I did that, my darling. I just did. Now.
Thank you for muting. I'll start again. Thank you. So I'm going to ask you to sit comfortably, close your eyes. Okay, so close your eyes and imagine that against your skin, you feel a fabric that is gloriously soft and luxurious, at the same time satiny and soft, the likes that you've never had caressing your skin. The same fabric effortlessly embracing a multitude of patterns and designs, embroiled with rich, deep jewel colors, including those of the deep color of red wine, the fresh yellows of daffodils, the bright green colors of the first leaves in spring, and the bright red colors of poppies. In my mind's eye, I can still see a riot of colored fluid fabrics scattered across the crumpled duvet on my mother's bed. My mother's silk sari these were. I inherited these when she passed away 2 years ago. It feels like I'm in outer space looking down at my mother's bed, delighting and appreciating the luminous and shimmering beauty of these silk saris, and at the same time feeling a depth of loss and sadness that reached the soles of my feet. Munjima Zarina wore her saris at minimum twice a week, on Fridays and Sundays, when she went to the Jamaat Khana, which is a mosque, to pray. It hardly took her a minute or two to drape one of these on her slim body, but the rituals before putting on her sari took much more time. She would always take a sari out of her bed, out of her cupboard an hour before she had to leave home for the mosque, and she'd lay it on her bed. Then she would look for the matching slip and blouse that she would wear underneath the sari and lay these side by side next to her own sari. She would walk to her dresser next, where she kept her gold necklaces, tasbih, bangles, and earrings in small porcelain and leather-bound jewelry boxes. She would take these cases and go and sit in her chair next to the window, where she would take her time going through her jewelry to look for some pieces that she thought would match with her choice of sari. She would then lay all these carefully next to the clothing on her bed. Munjima would then walk to the kitchen, where she would take down a small orangey-colored clay dish, the size of a saucer, from the cupboard that held odd bits of china, vases, corningware, and candles that she kept for emergencies. She would then heat this orangey-colored clay dish on the stove until it was piping hot, and when it was ready, take a small piece. She would take a small piece of coal and she would put a few pieces of oud. And oud is the essential oil from the resin of the agar tree mixed with the attar of fragrant flowers, and place these on the clay dish to heat. She would stand at the stove waiting for the oud to both start melting and releasing its musky scented attar of the fragrant flowers. When the first waft of perfume was detected, she would carry this dish to the bedroom and she'd use this to perfume her sari, slip and blouse. So not to waste the oud, she'd open the doors to her cupboard gently and not too wide, as she didn't want the musky smell of the oud to escape. She passed the clay dish at, above, and under all her clothes that were hanging in the cupboard. Munjima and all her clothes always smelled of this ancient, Eastern, deep, musky, sensual smell of the attar or the essence of exotic flowers. Today, these saris hang in my cupboard and still have a faint scent of oud, bringing me close to her. Once in a while on a Friday evening, I do wear one of the saris. And just as my mother did, I follow the same rituals she did before draping one on. When I follow Munjima's rituals and traditions, I feel a sense of connectedness, of history, and a feeling of oneness in that I am from my mother, and she from her mother, and my grandmother from her mother, and so on. There is also a sense of belonging, a belonging to another time, space, and place. But there is also a sense of deep sadness, as some of these traditions from the past may not have a place in the future. I am Fatima Shamsuddin Pirbhai Sundaji Samji Ladda Kurji Toba Jasani Illich. Family oral narratives inform me that my family originates from an area called Kutch, situated in the northwest of Gujarat, India. During both the time of the German colonial rule in Tanganyika and during the period of the Busaidi Sultanate of Zanzibar, my forefathers migrated to the east coast of Africa to both escape British colonial rule and for a better way of life. My father's family settled in Dar es Salaam, Tanganyika, and my mother's in Georgetown, Zanzibar. For more than a century, my family had lived on the east coast of Africa, but as members of the Indian diaspora. In 1961, Tanganyika became independent, and in 1964, Tanganyika and Zanzibar united to form the United Republic of Tanzania. During this time, I learned that we were not welcome there for several reasons, even though it had been our family home for several generations. During the time of civil unrest, my mother and I immigrated to Canada. However, my grandfather and father stayed behind, and so the land and familial ties to Tanzania remained, albeit as both an insider and outsider looking in. In Canada, I quickly learned that my brown body and cultural ways of being and knowing were not welcome here either. Much later, I also learned that the welcome extended by the Canadian government was not theirs to give, that Canada was in fact Turtle Island and rightfully belonged to the First Nations. For almost 5 decades, I have lived in a land where I have been made to feel that I do not belong. The centrality of relations to land that is part of both Indigenous and white identities is not part of my identity. I have a sense of being a bystander to this way of thinking. It is not part of my schema because of the transient nature of diasporic relations to land. I have a longing for Tanzania and India as places where I might be and feel at home, but this longing is based on an imaginary, because I have never visited India and I have only returned to Tanzania once since we left. Home as a relation to land is always temporary to me, because a return to home is an eternal impossibility, while a reframing of home is a continuous negotiation. My home is a diasporic space of in-betweenness, a space without land, the ethereal connections to home, where home is the steadfast emotional connections to the heart of my mother, the intermingling of our blood and bloodlines, our mutual connections to the spiritual realm, and our pursuit of the intellectual mind. Munjima, you are my land, you are my place, and you're my home.
And in this next slide, we're going to distinguish between religion and spirituality. While there's obviously an overlap between the two, it is possible to be spiritual without adhering to a particular religion, and in fact to be religious without being what many would consider to be deeply spiritual. And our purpose is to say that here we are specifically focusing on spirituality in its broadest sense. And we view it as a dimension to all educational relationships and not confined to what in curriculum terms, in colonial curriculum terms, might be called religious education. So we see a fundamental difference between religion and spirituality. Religion is a socially constructed system, usually institutionalized through a set of attitudes or beliefs and structures and practices that members of that religion agree to observe. In general, a formal religion is an experience that usually focuses on elements such as houses of worship, books of scripture, established rituals, and so on. Spirituality, we understand as a way of being and doing and viewing the world that is concerned with what some might call the soul or the spirit. And in general, the focus is on relationships between the internal self, the outside world, and the spirit world. And it's a dimension of what it means to be a being. And so we believe that the relationship between colonialism and spirituality played a central part in creating a world based on a logic of separation, a world in which relationships have become fractured. And in the coming slides, we're going to give some examples of this logic of separation that coloniality is, and the alienation that we find in education and educational relationships. And we're going to finish by setting out why the inclusion of a spiritual dimension we believe is crucial to decolonizing educational relationships and how this might be achieved. Fatima?
So our inclusion of a spiritual dimension has emerged from our personal experiences, as exemplified by my narrative at the beginning of this lecture, and theorizing from these everyday experiences. This content comes directly from Fran's and my experience with spirituality. Although we come from this from different parts, we have many areas of convergence. I was brought up in a faith-based tradition of spirituality where we learned from childhood that we are all interconnected, interrelated, and that we are interdependent to the people on this earth, those beyond the human and materiality around us. That we had an equal ethical responsibility to all these aspects and the sense of generosity that goes along with the three ways of thinking about being in the world. We also invoke our ancestral spirits and souls to bless us in our daily lives and to keep an eye over us. And I want to say to guide us. And to guide us. And through meditation, we attempt to achieve a spiritual connection with God or the spirit to become one with this spirit. However, we understand that meditation alone cannot achieve this. We have to remember and act in accordance with our understandings of interconnectedness, interrelatedness, and interdependence on the one hand, and our duty to achieving this oneness with God or the spirit and our responsibilities in the world. They both have equal weightage. Spirituality, therefore, cannot exist in my worldview without a critical understanding of the different forms of relationality, what it means to be spiritual, human, and humane, and that these cannot be separated into distinct categories of mind, body, spirit. In other words, it is an embodied in an embodied sense part of my identity, and these are not separable. The idea that the mind and body are distinct and separable is known as the Cartesian Split or Cartesian dualism. It was developed in the mid-17th century by René Descartes, who believed that humans consisted of matter, the physical self, the mind, which is the non-physical, and sometimes this is equated with the soul, that thinks, doubts, and remembers. Fran comes to spirituality from her ethical relationship in and with the world and the beings around her and her understanding of plural knowledges. Although brought up in the tradition of the Cartesian split of mind and body, which included being brought up as a Christian, Fran left the church in her early 20s due to disillusionment with what she perceived to be the dogma of the Christian faith. Perhaps because of her experiences as a farmer's daughter, intimately connected to the land and all living beings, Fran comes to spirituality in her ways of being, feeling, viewing, and doing in the world, where she connects with land, spirit, soul, energy across time and space. In both our instances, although differently, spirituality is embodied in the way that we ethically practice our lives, in our ways of thinking, viewing, and doing the world. It is about our practice, our unconditional generosity, our understanding and acceptance of plural knowledges in the world, and that we exist both in and beyond the material world in deeply connected ways. It is a holistic understanding of what it means to be generous of spirit, generous of intellect and of knowledge, and what it means to be human and humane. When it comes to education, Alexander and McLaughlin in 2003 speak of two types of spiritual education. That which is tethered, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble, tethered to a particular denomination or religion, and that which is untethered. Spirituality that is religiously tethered has a particular framework of belief, practice, and value, and is aimed at the search for purpose and truth, conceived in rather special ways, as in the search, for example, what is ultimate or sacred. Alternatively, untethered spiritual education can proceed from little more than an understanding that there is something more to life than is apparent on its surface, and can be radically unstructured and open-ended. What this simple dichotomy denotes is that spiritual education can be both inside and outside religion. For us, this affirms that spirituality is an intrinsic part of what it means to be human. It stresses that teaching about spirituality does not necessarily start from the theological categories of a religious system, but rather from the capacity for spirituality in every individual.
Okay, in this slide where we've adapted a framework outlined in a film called The Uprising. And what it does is it looks at how you can uncover the lies of coloniality. The way in which coloniality portrays itself is very different to the actual experience of people at the front end of coloniality. So Said, in his seminal work, Orientalism, made a distinction between colonialism, which was founded on the Christian theological thought, and modern colonialism that followed the Enlightenment and the Cartesian split that we've just referred to. The modern form of Orientalism inherited the colonial structures of the past, but then secularized and rationalized them, giving them a scientific terminology. Which was described as secular because in Europe, along with the split between mind and body, there was a split between the church and the state. However, the overall narrative of colonialism remained the same, and it positioned colonized people as uncivilized savages whose, and I apologize for the language, whose spiritual traditions were primitive, backward, and even European pagan forms of spirituality were similarly framed within this narrative. And all of this was from a Western Christian perspective, that if people are savage, they can't be religious or godly, and therefore they are less than human. And the spirituality of the other was either exoticized and or put in opposition with religion. And to reiterate the dominance of this scientific way of thinking and how it others spirituality, we quote from a piece written by Marara Das in 2020. Science deals with matter. It doesn't accept any spiritual knowledge because spiritual knowledge is first revealed and then experienced. Science is based on starting from scratch with what humans can observe, test, and rationalize. It works on empirical evidence, not revealed evidence. No matter how convincing spiritual knowledge may be regarding the soul, reincarnation, God, and different paths, science cannot accept it unless there is in some sense data that anyone can verify. Because spiritual verification is experienced subjectively, by following a process, science cannot approach it, because even if a scientist follows the process, his experience can't be simply transferred to another scientist who hasn't followed the process, and so it's not considered reliable information. On top of that, science doesn't want anything spiritual to exist, because then scientists would not be the self-appointed guardians of valuable knowledge for mankind. So what science does is it presents everything in a particular way, and what we've got here in the framework is on the left-hand side the lies of coloniality, and then on the right-hand side how we have applied that to spirituality. So there's a particular terminology that is used, such as saviorism, a civilizing mission, conversion, but that hides underneath it the lies of spiritual and bodily violence, of colonizing and controlling minds, of coercion, and so on. And then it uses selective facts and single stories to support the position that is trying to be portrayed. And a narrative of lies is then created around that, and colonialism gave that, for the colonizers, a positive spin, saving hearts and minds from godlessness and superstition. And then a grand theory, such as the Enlightenment, the rise of civilization, modernity, and neoliberalism, is then provided as a further framing. And within all of that, we see the complete erasure of ethics, the mind-body-spirit split, how rationality becomes dominant, Christianity is the religion of the civilized world, and so on. And to demonstrate that this is not something of the past, in this slide, we're going to look at some of the contemporary lies of colonialism and how they position their actions in African countries. And Shani has already mentioned something about global education. And in my earlier career as an academic, I was a global educator who was involved in taking groups of teachers and students to places in the global south. I've learned to be very critical of the work that I was complicit in at that time. So in 2010, I was in the Gambia, West Africa, staying with friends while working on a sustainable educational partnership program. During my stay, I came across a leaflet designed to encourage European tourists to donate money for children's education. And it read, "Sponsor a child at the Don McMath Foundation for only £60 a year." The Gambia in West Africa is one of the smallest and poorest of African countries which relies on peanuts and tourism for its income. There is no free education in the Gambia, and our aim is to give children from the poorest Gambian families an education. There are two lies embedded in this leaflet, or at least two. The first is that although it may be the case that in 2010 tourism accounted for 17.2% of the gross domestic product, this represented only $1 in every 10 that tourism generates, because the other $9 goes overseas to the travel companies and their partners, whose employees are mostly European, and to the fresh fruit and vegetables that are imported from Europe to serve the tourist industry. In the second example, this is Nene's story, the friend I was staying with. And I quote from my diary entry at the time. Nene told me at breakfast that her son, who is 5 years old, was sent back from school this morning because the Belgian sponsors had come to visit. They are a Christian organisation, and once a year they visit to see how the school is progressing and to give gifts of books and pens to the children. However, they only give the gifts to the children who have a sponsor, so the other children were sent home to avoid embarrassment on behalf of the Belgians. Later that week, the Belgians' visit was reported on local radio, and the leader of the group was heard saying, "We're here to help the poorest of the poor." Nene asked me what that meant and was very upset when I explained it to her, as she obviously does not consider her family to be the poorest of the poor. And an article in the British newspaper, The Guardian, summarises the rationale of such actions in this way. Volunteerism and similar activities may be fueled by noble feelings, but it's built on perverse economics. Many organisations offer volunteers the chance to dig wells, build schools, and do other construction projects in poor villages. It's easy to understand why it's done in this way. If a charity hires locals for unskilled work, it would be spending money. If it uses volunteers who pay to be there, it's raising money. Fatima. You need to unmute.
In this slide, we return to the previous framework that we used, but we changed the terms in the left-hand column to reflect a D/colonial perspective, where lies become truths and selective facts become plurality, and the narrative of lies becomes counter-narratives, and the grand theory becomes theories. And then again, we have the erasure of ethics, which becomes ethic. And Bhattacharya argues that a D/colonial agenda is inherently an agenda of spiritual activism, in that it allows one to imagine and even travel to other worlds of possibility where all of us are free. Ansel Dua and Keating demonstrate how imagination's soul dimension bridges body and nature to spirit and mind, making these connections in the in-between space of Nepantla. Through Nepantla, one acquires additional, potentially transformative perspectives, different ways to understand ourselves, our circumstances, and our worlds. It's as if Nepantla shoves us partially outside of our previously comfortable frameworks and pushes us into a frictional, contradictory clash of worldviews, challenges us to make some sort of meaning from chaos, and thus forces us to change. Broken Leg describes the spirit of belonging in indigenous culture as kinship, noting that the ultimate test of kinship was not genetic, but behavioral. You belonged as a relative if you acted like you belonged. Treating others as kin forged powerful human bonds that drew everyone into a network of relationships based on mutual trust. In an online resource for schools in Alberta called Cultures of Belonging, they argue that approaches that foster a sense of belonging for all students can build on the indigenous notion that everything in the universe is part of a single whole. Everything is connected in some way. This notion, along with ideas from other relational traditions, can shape and guide the creation of a classroom community where students, parents, and other community members see themselves reflected and a vital part of the relational space. Go to the next slide. Thank you. To summarize, spirituality is therefore responsive to multiple wisdom traditions, which may or may not be constructed as a religion. It is a way of being based on the belief in the existence of things outside of the body, that is, outside the experiencing and cognitive knowledge of material reality. In this respect, it is a way of knowing that is embodied and affective, that expands our perception and awareness. It is also a philosophy, a worldview, a perspective, and a perception. Some call it an energy source. It expands perception to become conscious, even in sleep, and to become aware of the interconnections between all things by attaining a grand or holistic perspective. Because spirituality can be conceived of as an all-encompassing energy, even a moment or a glimpse of such an energy would perhaps reveal the interconnectedness of all beings and things in the universe, including ourselves, bringing us into harmony with the world and diminishing feelings of isolation, loneliness, and disconnection. Spirituality, therefore, is about connecting with and across multiple ways of viewing, being, and doing. It doesn't reject the wisdom of Euro-Western thought, but sees it as one form of wisdom among many. It requires living with contradictions, suspending rational sense-making and using intuition instead. It comes through the sense of being with rather than doing to. It can be through connection with nature, through music, reading, and discovering new approaches to problems. It combines fact, fiction, dreams, desires, visions, and meditative insights. As an ethical relation, spiritual connections in the classroom would require or involve what I use, the terms that I use, noticing, seeing and connecting with each other and every student and all their relations in all their ways of being, including those that are spiritual. Fran?
Sorry. So to come back to the devastatingly harmful effect of coloniality on education and the nature of colonial education, we're going to focus on coloniality's alienating effect on the spirit, as described by scholars who've been subjected to colonization in different ways. Ansel Duer and Keating argue that coloniality leads to an extreme hyper-individualized realism in which all objects, including human beings, are ultimately independent and separated or withdrawn from all others. Colonization, as we've heard earlier today, creates a fractured self. Its wounds can be physical, psychic, cultural, and spiritual. Ansel Duer, like Said, emphasizes the role of language. Words and images matter and are matter. And Barbara talked about that earlier. They can have a causal, material, and materializing force. Cope Meek, an Anishinaabe scholar, demonstrates how the long-standing, ongoing colonial violence perpetrated on Aboriginal peoples, an obvious example of which is residential schools, has resulted in injury to the minds and spirits of Aboriginal peoples. And Lenny Strobel, a Filipino scholar living and working in the academy in the United States, describes how her Cartesian split between mind and body was also a spirit-body split, a consequence of which was an emotional distancing and a disconnection from her authentic self. This alienating effect is embedded, we argue, in current westernized education systems. Education based on a Western model is a state-organized colonial narrative that is coercive. It's a forced forgetting and amnesia of alternative ways of being, doing, knowing, and valuing that perpetuates the spirit-mind-body split. Those marked as other have to constantly perform different versions of themselves in order to fit in, creating an inner dualism. So we argue also that neoliberalism has reinforced and extended the coloniality of education. And Doug asked a question relating to that earlier. There is an emphasis on the ego, a westernized version of self-actualization, individuality, and competition. And in such a system, not succeeding is equated with failure rather than a point of growth, while success is monitored by regimes of accountability, requiring commodification, standardization, and objectification. And in this example of the sickness, what we call the sickness of colonial neoliberal education, one example of that is the numbers of families that choose to homeschool their children. And as the figures here show, in Saskatchewan, there has been a 21% rise between 2014 and 2019 in families choosing to home educate their children. This rise is found in all provinces across Canada, with the exception of British Columbia, where the number of children being homeschooled has fallen. Manitoba, Alberta, and Saskatchewan show the highest percentage rise, and reasons parents give for homeschooling include it will give a better education, religious values, a better family dynamic, the ability to individualize education, and better socialization. So we ask, what sort of education system is it that if more and more parents are deciding that actually they can do better at home?
Okay, so implications for education. Our rationale for bringing a spiritual dimension into education is therefore that, number one, we know that the system is sick. It is not serving all students equally. We have put this down to the colonial neoliberalization of education and its regimes of accountability, as well as to the forms of coercive relationships that such a system demands. Coloniality is based on a logic of separation that has created fractured selves across the system within education and society. And we believe that a spiritual, soulful dimension is a healing element that is crucial to the process of de/colonization. To be clear, including a spiritual dimension in education is not for us about spiritual development, which may be associated with linear stages of development, but rather about spiritual growth. As Judy Iseke says, spirituality is strength as a life force, which aids the decolonization of the mind in the school system, and not attending to the spirit would make decolonizing work incomplete. Through spirituality, you can then be a subject of change rather than an object of change. So in this slide, we summarize how we conceptualize a spiritual dimension. And in the final slide, we apply this to de/colonizing educational relationships. This is our last slide, where we talk about the spiritual dimension to educational relationships. A spiritual, soulful dimension to educational relationships would require all educators to develop their own understanding of spirituality, and thus the interconnected, interrelated, and interdependent nature of life, not for self-improvement or for self-advancement through appropriation, but for understanding how to work in different ways to establish nurturing relationships, particularly with those who are being marginalized and failed by the system. Such understandings would enable educators to develop a sense of unconditional generosity, without which it would be difficult to embody decolonizing ways of being, doing, and viewing in the world. Establish a different form of relationship with colleagues, students, and between students. Establish a different form of collective relationship, sense of community, in and beyond the confines of the classroom, school, and college. Attend to the spirit and soul, as well as the mind and heart, in establishing that sense of connection and belonging. This is what some might describe as a pedagogy of love and generosity. And we begin to explore this in our next seminar. Thank you very much. I'd like to give you time to come to talk about what you've heard today so far, and then we can go into a lunch break.